Hello and welcome to episode 450 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
Well, quite excited, to be honest, that we've hit 450. It's got a round number. It feels like it should be something significant. Well, it's a significant step on the way to 500, which I think is the big milestone that we're looking forward to hitting, if I'm honest.
Yeah, if we think about dates and how many episodes and shows we do a year, we tend to have a couple of weeks off throughout the year. So pretty much I expect the 500th episode, which will be an extravaganza, no doubt, is going to be sort of arriving in people's pod feeds, I would say, maybe February, March next year. So yeah, look out for that.
So that's exciting. And it's also going to be our 10th anniversary in the summer of this year as well. So to say a big thank you if you've enjoyed the podcast. I have been receiving your emails when you write in. I do enjoy them and we share them with the team because they're incredibly motivating, people sharing their stories of how the podcast has helped them. Do please leave a review on the podcast app of choice. So if it's Apple Podcasts or you're using a new podcast app like Andy is this week. Andy came into work absolutely buzzing about a new podcast app. You probably know that Andy is a real, I don't know what the word is, anorak seems a little bit offensive, but you are, is it aficionado? I don't know. You're a real fan of podcasts. So he's downloaded a new podcast app. Whatever app you choose, then do please leave a 5-star review and we may read your review out. And if we do, you could be in line for a Money to the Masses mug.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm just looking at the stats on my old app, which I've now ditched, by the way, 2,713 hours. And I have to say that didn't even account for quite a few of the early day pods that I downloaded in the original way, via iTunes and everything else. So it says that I am a master according to their stats. But unfortunately, that app is no more. I've moved on to a new one and I'm very happy. I don't feel any guilt or any shame.
So that means, Andy, that you have listened to over 100 days of podcasts, like non-stop. If you were to start in 100 days with no sleep, that's how much you have listened to. That is quite incredible. I'm in awe.
And if you think about it, that doesn't even account for the fact of the editing that I do on this show, because that is officially, obviously, a podcast. It's our podcast, but I probably listen to it at least twice through when I'm doing editing. So yeah, you could probably add another 500 hours into there. So at least.
Well, you must do, because we've incredible. Andy is the podcast master, according to his app and probably everybody else who listens to this show. So what's on the show this week? 3 pieces as usual. We're going to be doing a piece on income investing. So every year I do a piece of research that takes me a long time to do. I go through the income funds out there, be it global equity income funds, UK income funds, but also investment trusts, and look at how they have performed from a dividend paying perspective over time. And so for those people who are looking to build an income portfolio, maybe now or in the future, that will be of particular interest. There's some lessons in the findings. And the second piece I'm going to be doing talks about a Japanese way of saving and spending mindfully called Kakeibo, but also goes on to talk about financial journaling and the potential benefits. And the final piece on the podcast, Andy, you're going to be talking about?
I'm going to be talking about a brand new scheme that's been launched to enable people to afford new build homes. It's called the Rate Reducer Scheme, and it means that people could potentially attain a mortgage rate of just 0.99%. So I'll be talking about what that is and how it works.
And before I actually start the first piece on the podcast, don't forget that next week, so Wednesday the 6th of March, is budget day. So we are going to get the latest budget from Jeremy Hunt. We'll of course cover all the details on the Money to the Masses website, and more than likely, depending on what is actually announced, we'll probably do a piece on the podcast next week discussing the key details. So listen out for that. Right, the first piece on the podcast, income investing. Now, as I mentioned at the start, every year for 80/20 investor members, I go through hundreds of funds looking at how they performed in terms of paying dividends. So just to take a step back, if you want to invest for income, it's different for investing for growth. So if you want a portfolio to pay out a regular income to you that you could perhaps live off, then you need to invest in a slightly different way, especially if you want a reliable income that's going to grow over time. So inflation is something that people understand now as a result of the cost of living crisis. Previously, lots of people probably didn't pay too much attention to inflation numbers, but now they realise the importance of costs and how much they rise. So if you've got an income, whether it be a wage or in this case, an investment portfolio is going to be paying you an income, you will want that income to grow over time. Otherwise, the buying power of that income stream will reduce. So if you look to build a portfolio that's going to produce an income over time, and you're not going to invest in individual shares because that is obviously risky and you're putting all your eggs into one basket, one way of doing that is to have a portfolio of funds that produce payouts over time, which you can then use to live off. And as part of 80/20 Investor, every year I look at all the different funds out there and analyse their payouts over time. So what you want is a fund that has a reliable history of payouts, because what could happen is you may pick a fund and think it's got a good yield, so you think it's going to pay an attractive income, but then that might be cut or the payout might actually reduce over time, because don't forget what funds will do is invest in lots of companies, and those companies will pay dividends, which therefore make up the payouts that the fund gives to the investors that invest in it. So you want to invest in a fund that is managing the income stream that it's receiving from dividends well, by investing in those companies that are going to be paying, hopefully increasing dividends over time, which then can be passed on to you as the end investor. So by looking at all the funds and analysing their payouts from year to year, you can build up heat maps. So we've built these heat maps for 80/20 Investor. You could take out a free trial to see them, and it's a very quick visual way of you seeing which funds have either increased their payouts each year, going back 16 years we cover. So we go all the way back into the early 2000s, looking at how the income payouts have changed over time. So what you would want to see is a heat map that shows that the payouts increased year on year. And so if you invested in that fund, then of course you would hope that your payout would increase over time as well. The other thing you've got to bear in mind, you want one that's going to pay you a decent amount of income, not just a very low level that increases. You want a decent level of income, and you want that to increase over time. So these heat maps and this analysis enables you to quickly see the winners and losers from a income portfolio perspective. Now, I can't show you these heat maps on a podcast, but I want to give you some of the high level insight. So if you are an income investor, you can use it as a benchmark and you get an understanding of what's going on out there. So if an income investor is drawing an income from their portfolio, typically what would happen is that you might have a portfolio of funds and you have a cash pool that you might draw your money from that you live off, and then you have the funds that pay money to top that up over a period of time. So at the end of a year, you get back to the amount of money that you need each year. So you're basically building up a buffer that the money's going into, and then at the end of each year, that buffer should be enough to pay you for the next year. So what it does, it stops you having to cash in lumps of your investments. As an income investor, you're not so bothered about the portfolio value going up and down. You're worried about the income stream that they're producing. So bear that in mind. Now, UK equity income funds would be an automatic place you'd start to look if you wanted to build an income portfolio. So we're looking at the unit trusts and looking at all the analysis, the funds that still exist, because lots get closed over time. There were 32 funds that live in the sector of UK equity income funds. And those 32 that I looked at, of them, 20 increased their payout in 2023 compared to 2022. So you can already see there were quite a number that didn't. So 12 didn't increase their payouts. They in fact cut their payout. So as an income investor, you'd be getting less income from those individual funds. Now, if you're building a portfolio, what you want is a range of funds, so therefore you're not at the whim of a particular fund manager and their income producing performance. I also look at how they've performed over time. So what's the annual growth rate on average over the last 5 years? Because of course there were years like the pandemic where every fund pretty much, when we're talking about unit trusts, cut their income payouts, because obviously companies cut their dividend payments. So if the underlying companies cut their dividend payments, then unit trusts, because they don't store the income, they pay out when they receive it, would have cut their payouts. Now, only 14 funds grew their payout over the last 5 years on an average annualized basis. Typically, if you looked at the last 5 years, the annual rate of growth of the payouts for these funds was actually 0.8%, minus 0.88%, I should say. So they slightly fell over time. That means in a cost of living crisis, when your costs are going up, if you were invested in a typical UK equity income fund, your payout from that fund has slowly been going down over the last 5 years. So you need to make sure you're picking the funds that have been able to increase their payouts. What sort of yield do you get? So if you're an income investor, what are the yields you're looking at? On average, it's 5%. The highest you're going to get is around about 7.3%. The lowest is about 3.8%. But the higher your yield, typically, because they use some form of derivative to create that yield, then that tends to fall over time. So the highest yielding fund currently has actually had the worst performance in terms of payout growth over the last 5 years. In fact, the payout is 6%, nearly 7% lower than it was 5 years ago on an annualized basis. So that's the UK unit trust sector. What you should think there is actually they're a little bit unreliable if you're trying to build a portfolio. Like all types of investing, if you're a growth investor, you want to diversify your risks. Same if you're an income investor. So there are different types of assets. You could go for global equity income funds that will invest in companies overseas. Typically the US is where it predominantly will be invested to try and generate income. And there were 20 funds in the analysis that I looked at. 14 of them grew their payouts in 2023, and 13 of them have actually got a positive annualized growth in their payouts over the last 5 years of 2.39%. So what you can see is that if you look at inflation in the UK, which I know at the moment is running very high, but it's targeted to be 2%. But typically that's the area it will be. Global equity income funds have actually managed to generate a growth in their payouts on average of over 2% in the last 5 years, and that's taken into account the dismal pandemic period. Now, in terms of yield, you're looking at 11.28% is the most you're probably going to get, down to 0.6% with an average of about 3.4%. So global equity income funds are much more reliable payers. If you're diversifying, then you're probably going to get slightly lower yield, and that is reflective typically of the price of the share. So if there's a lot of US equity shares in there, the price has probably risen, meaning the yield you're going to get. So the yield the managers are getting on the individual shares will be lower, and therefore your overall payout yield for that fund is going to be lower. Don't forget, income funds hold lots and lots of different company shares. Now, this is where it gets interesting, and the one thing I want people to really take away, I've talked about it in the past, and it just shows this fact plays out over time. If you want an income portfolio, you need to look at investment trusts, because investment trusts, there were 37 funds I looked at across the UK and globally. And of those 37 funds, 28 of them grew their payout in 2023. 5 of them kept it the same, and 4 of them decreased it. So only 4. And of the 37 funds, 31 of them increased their payouts on average annually. It's an annualized basis over the last 5 years. And that annual growth rate in the payout was typically 3.1%. So you can see that once again, investment trusts are able to be consistent payers. So that is down to the fact that they can hold dividend payments they receive and smooth the payouts over time in the future, something that unit trusts can't do. And the yield you're looking at on an investment trust, this is across the board, so it is slightly muddies the waters because there's global investment trusts in here as well as ones in the UK, but the average is 5.2%, the highest is 11.3%, and the lowest is 2.2%. But the point is, if you're an income investor and you're looking at a fund, so a collective investment, you need to look at investment trusts because they are the most reliable income payers over time and increase their payouts over time. And a brilliant example of this is the City of London Trust. So that particular investment trust has grown its payout 57 years in a row. So if you were invested in that for 57 years, every year the payout you received was going to be more than the previous year. So that is an incredible achievement, and that is down to the management of that investment trust, but also the structure. So the big takeaway, income investors, make sure you look at investment trusts. Of course, yes, there are going to be things you need to look at in terms of premiums and discounts. But as I mentioned, if you're an income investor, you're principally interested in the level of the payout, but the consistency of it, but also the growth of that payout over time. I do cover alternative assets as well in 80/20 Invest. I'm not going to talk about them today. So things like bonds and property funds as income generators, they're not as reliable as income funds, and particularly investment trusts that invest in equities, because they invest in assets that tend to have relatively fixed payments. So you're looking at bonds and therefore property to a certain extent as well. So they can't grow their payouts year on year in the same way that you can, or as easily, I should say, as equity funds do. So there you go, nice roundup of where we are in 2024. We're in a much better position than we were a few years ago.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then. Damien, we've talked about budgeting before, but actually we're going to talk about something slightly different that's kind of linked to budgeting. We're going to be talking about journaling.
Yeah, so journaling is something that you may have come across. in your life, and normally it's in relation to other things. So if you think about it in the most basic way, a diary. So if you imagine, there are lots of people who probably wrote a diary when they were younger, when they were teenagers. But the reason people do it is because by writing down your thoughts and feelings, it helps you understand them. And a diary is a place that you can express your thoughts and feelings without any fear or judgment. And some people find it reduces stress as well. So there's lots of obvious positives for writing a diary or journaling. And journaling, I suppose, is like a diary, but it can be a little bit more flexible, and people sometimes do visual ones, so they might draw, for example. It could be quite fluid, so it's very personal to them and what they do, but it helps them to express themselves and to perhaps think more clearly. And so journaling has become quite a movement. But it's all about well-being. And if you think about money, money is inherently linked to people's well-being. And so there is a natural link and a movement of something called financial journaling. So in podcast 445, which we produced earlier this year, I talked about the importance of money reflections. And if you go back to that, that was saying really that you need to look back on how you've done with your money, on how things have gone, good or bad, so you can help to avoid the same mistakes, or pat yourself on the back, be grateful and plan for the future, and hopefully achieve your future goals. And one of the things you might do is use things like budgeting apps, which people know that I'm very keen on, and that helps you with that whole reflection. But using a journal is slightly different because you're writing in the here and now as things happen. So you might write about a situation in terms of what's happening in your spending, being very conscious about what you're doing, reflecting upon things that are happening with you financially. It could be about a particular thing that you've bought and why you did it, and where things have gone good or they have gone bad. And you can analyze mishaps, you can use it to help you reach goals. And it's particularly popular with people who are trying to overcome debts, so they're trying to pay them. And you could also use budgeting in it. So there are people who financially journal who start to put their budgeting in this journal. And if you think about it, there are lots of blogs that have actually started this way, because what people will do is they might write about their journey in clearing their debt, and it becomes an element of accountability, and they start writing effectively an online diary. And there are so many people that I know, having done this for many years and have met, who started off on a money journey and end up becoming experts along the way about things like debt, or whether it might be something like investing or whatever it might be. And that is a form of financial journaling, but it's done without pen and paper, but online. So as an aside, if you started to become interested in doing a financial journal, there is a case that if you did it online, maybe at some point you could turn into a future career. Don't forget, Money to the Masses wasn't a financial journal, but it was something that started off as me writing about money that did end up becoming what you know today. So one of the tips I would say is, if you're going to do this, you've got to make it easy. You could do it in a book, which typically people do, but you can do it online. You can write, you can draw, do whatever you want. And you could also do it at set times regularly, whenever you like, in the evening or something like that. So journaling is something to have a look at. You can read more about it online. But one of the things that people might do is in their journal, look at their budgeting. So make notes about what they're doing. And this brought me onto something called Kakeibo, which is a Japanese technique that was created by, I hope I'm going to say this correctly, Hani Motoko in 1904, a female journalist who created a method of managing your finances aimed principally at women, which I really like, given that we're coming up to International Women's Day soon. So this idea was to combine mindfulness into spending decisions. So the whole point of Kakeibo is that you end up becoming mindful about your spending and your saving, with the ultimate aim of spending well and saving well. So I'm going to give you just a very high level summary about it. I'm going to put a link in the notes of the podcast so people can find out more about it. But ultimately, the way it works is that you split your money into 4 categories. So there's income, there's fixed costs, there's savings, and there's living expenses. So you can see it starts to sound a little bit like when we talked about the 50-30-20 principle, when you start looking at the types of spending that you have. And the idea is that you get your fixed costs, so that'll be things like your rent or your mortgage and the things you have to pay, like your utilities. Those are your needs in other systems. And then everything else you look at, and that's your money for the rest of the month, and that's what you're going to use to try and then spend and save well. And the idea is that you start to become very conscious about what you're doing, very present. So you start making decisions, and people's notebooks, one of the key principles about this system is the encouragement to use pen and paper, which is why I wanted to bring it onto the podcast, because it's very different to using budgeting apps. And by using pen and paper and writing down transactions and recording things like a ledger, then what you're doing is you're making yourself very conscious and present when spending, but also actively setting money aside as well when you save. And it's been shown by writing something down that your brain assimilates what you're doing better. So I suppose the parallel would be if you were studying and you start to write notes, rather than just reading something and then just hoping it goes into your memory, by making notes and drawings and things like that, that helps you to make change and memorize something. So this whole concept then starts to make you spend well and save well. And there are tips that I've read online where people say maybe you do it for 5 minutes a day, and you've got your journal and it's probably very colourful, lots of writing in it, using lots of different coloured pens to make sure that you keep track of everything. You could do it every time you purchase something. You could do it once a week. And there are some people who even suggest that rather than using cards as transactions, you go back to the old method and use cash when you're spending as well. So again, that slows things down, makes you very conscious and very present. And of course, this concept links very nicely to journaling. So the whole idea of you becoming very present, writing something down, whether it's in a ledgers type format, much more like that Kakeibo, and you're also doing something that could be a little bit more creative around it in terms of your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, all the sorts of different things to do with money and your decision making, not just your budgeting. This could be a way that some people may have more success, because the one downside of budgeting apps, despite me liking them, is that they are automated, and unless you make yourself consciously engage with that app on a regular basis, then there's a danger that you actually stop connecting with your money and your decisions. You become less present, and therefore that could be a negative for your overall well-being, because then you start to feel you're losing control again. So the whole idea of journaling, Kakeibo, is also very good for reflection, because that's a key part as well. You then go back and reflect on the things, linking back to that past podcast that I mentioned, where you could then look at your successes and things you might want to change, but you're doing it in a much more continual present basis. So we put links in the show notes. It may be something that helps certain people. I do know, for example, my wife is a big fan of using pen and paper rather than using technology. She writes lists for everything. They're scattered around my house all the time. I find lists for all different things. And so it may be for those people who are having less success with the app-based version or using technology, this might be something different that they could try.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. And it's just a short piece on a new scheme that's been introduced. So I'll explain what it is, Damien, and maybe you and I can have a quick discussion on where we feel it might benefit people and where we might be in a few months' time, because it is in its infancy. So the scheme is called the Rate Reducer Scheme, which is a scheme that is designed to enable more people to afford new build homes, but with a crucial difference, because people will end up saving money on the amount that they repay on their mortgage, at least initially. So this scheme has initially been supported by a couple of main lenders, namely Halifax and Virgin Money, and that's in partnership with the developer Barratt Homes, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about. Now, there will be other lenders that will join this scheme as time moves on, and also, no doubt, some other property developers will be joining the scheme as well. Ultimately, the way it works is it will enable people with a deposit who would like a new build home but are worried about or scared about the potential mortgage repayments, because interest rates have obviously been rising in recent years. It will give them a discount to that mortgage rate for the first either 2 or 5 years. And when I talk about discount, it is significant. So as we know, the best mortgage rates you can tend to get at the moment are somewhere between sort of 4 and 6%. People being accepted on this scheme could ultimately achieve an interest rate of just 0.99%. However, I do have to mention a caveat on that. That is reserved for people who have a significant deposit. So if you've got a 40% deposit on this scheme, theoretically, you could land yourself on a 0.99% mortgage deal. So if you want to take advantage of this scheme and you're particularly interested in a new build, is you'll first need to source a property through a participating property developer. So at present, Barratt Homes is the only developer that's part of this scheme, but there will be more added to that. And once you've agreed a purchase price for the property, you will then need to source the mortgage which can be arranged through a specialist mortgage broker, and it has to be a mortgage broker that is specifically listed as being able to advise on this type of scheme. And actually, we'll put details in the show notes of a particular mortgage broker that we have reviewed on the Money to the Masses website, which is particularly good for first-time buyers. And so Harvey has crunched the numbers on this, and we've got a news piece that we've put on the Money to the Masses website, so you can have a look at that and see exactly what this scheme is and the cost savings available. But on a £350,000 purchase price on a mortgage term of 25 years, if you're lucky enough to have a 40% deposit, obviously not everyone is, but let's say you've got that 40% deposit and you qualify for this scheme. Just to give you an example, the difference, instead of a mortgage rate of 4.38%, which is the typical rate based on a 60% LTV mortgage over a 2-year fixed term, instead of 4.38%, you'll be paying just 0.99% on this scheme. And so on a monthly repayment basis, instead of paying £1,152 a month, you'll pay just £790 a month. Again, that is just guaranteed for the first 2 years. The mortgage would then revert to a standard mortgage. You'd have to remortgage in the usual way, and likely you'll be paying much higher rates in a couple of years' time. But this is certainly something that is a consideration for those looking for a new build property who have a deposit, they're ready to go, and they want to save money on that initial interest rate.
Okay, so that's interesting, Andy. I mean, like you said, we got a news piece on the Money to the Masses website, and we are waiting for more details on it. But just from me looking at it and listening to what you've been saying about the scheme, it does seem very much a scheme that's designed to help house builders. They have such influence in politics, and really it's like somebody's subsidising a few £1,000s off of someone's mortgage for a couple of years. And for a house builder to do that, who's to say how much they're actually charging for the house? It's actually could be built into the house price itself anyway, and they are effectively selling a house that they maybe otherwise wouldn't have done to somebody who's got a sizable deposit. So it's less risk for the banks and building societies who are backing this scheme. But then in 2 years' time, that person's going to have to pay the going rate for a mortgage anyway. So it does seem a scheme that on the surface is very attractive to people trying to get onto the property ladder who really want a new build. But at the same time, it does seem to be helping plenty of people in terms of mortgage lenders and house builders. So anyway, that's just a high level look at it from my point of view, just seeing the details. If anything new comes of it, then I might have to change my tune slightly. So that's it then, Andy. Are we done for this week?
We are done for this week. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can do so in the usual way. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com or Andy at moneytothemasses.com. Always happy to hear your feedback on the show or any ideas for any future shows. Please also do review the podcast via your podcast app of choice. 5 stars would be absolutely fantastic. And anyone who does that, please do email us and claim your review, and you may be in line for a coveted Money to the Masses mug.
And as always, don't forget to follow us on our social channels, YouTube in particular. Subscribe to the channel. We're always doing videos about topics that don't make it onto the podcast because they won't make good podcast pieces. They might be too timely, might be talking about the latest mortgage rates. It could be about house prices. It could be about a product that we review. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on things like Instagram, our Facebook group as well, facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses. So that is it, Andy. All that's left to say is until next time.
Until next time.